So it's very exciting to be here. I hope you can all hear me. I'm not managing the chat, so I won't read anything until I'm done. So, okay, hello everyone. I'd like to thank everyone who has come from UNM and overseas, and also the ones that are watching online, obviously. This is an important day for me, and I love to see that you have taken the time to come to watch me present my dissertation topic that I've been working on during the last 4 years. So let's get started, best with a quote. So linguists have often wondered why language does not work perfectly, or why it forces us to say more or less than we intend to do. And so Georg von der Gabelend said, I translated it in German into English. We never say everything we think. We almost leave something for the discerning listener to add here and there. And yet many languages, when taken word by word and letter by letter, say much more than is necessary for communication. Certainly more than the speaker has thought and intended. Those conventional expressions in which one thinks nothing and yet everyone uses them and expects them to be used by others, they have their equivalent counterpart in linguistic forms. Those concepts, for example, that underlie grammatical gender, have long become foreign to our thinking and feeling, and yet language clings to the corresponding forms. And a German child laughs at the foreigner who says die Mond instead of der Mond, or der Bein instead of das Bein. This useless expression still firmly roots itself in the soil of our feeling of language. So let's shift this discussion from arbitrary gender assignment in German to conjugations in Spanish. Every student that has learned Spanish at school might have come across tables like these that dictate how a verb needs to be inflected. Why are verbs in Spanish or even other Indo-European languages difficult to learn? Well, not really because of the number of forms, but because the forms themselves depend on the verb that one must learn, and either dictated by the verb or by lexical conjugation classes. We see how the endings here differ from verb to verb, which are the same meaning, like. And then on the other hand, we see how there are root changes, which again, only introduce more form than need to be learned without contributing any additional meaning. So for example, trike means the same as tra here, like to carry. This type of lexically restricted conjugations have been called various names, among them a flexive, defective, non-predictable conjugation class, lexical idiosyncrasy, or lexical conditioning. I'd like to go with lexical conditioning for reasons that are important to this dissertation. Quite interestingly, lexically conditioned inflection is pervasive not only in the European language like Spanish or even English, which is with its difficult to learn stem alternation patterns. Navajo, for example, has stem alternation patterns for every verb, and there isn't even a productive one or verbs that do not alternate. So to learn a Navajo verb, one would have to learn the patterns verb by verb. So this type of lexically conditioned inflection is hard to learn, only if you would disagree. Dahl, like Kabelend, says that lexical idiosyncrasy does seem to be an irrational, counterproductive property of language. The changes that introduce it make grammar less predictable and less ordered. Lexical idiosyncrasy would thus seem to be nothing but historical baggage or diachronic junk. Again, despite its apparent lack of functional motivation and difficulty to learn, there is evidence that this type of reflection can remain in languages for ages. And Dahl continues and acknowledges that some elements of languages, such as phenomena like upload in Semitic languages, are probably among the oldest traceable and still current cultural phenomena. The only serious competitors are general technological innovations such as agriculture, more specific elements of human culture such as religion, calendars, etc. seldom go further back than 2,000, 3,000 years. So that exaggerate, but that shows it. If lexically conditioned, the big question that this dissertation is concerned with is why lexically conditioned inflection, which I will call from now on LCI, can remain so long in languages despite being more difficult to learn than, say, a non-lexically conditioned inflection. One can examine the properties of LCI that can justify its existence by showing how it behaves in historical or in psycholinguistic studies. But what has driven my interest is how complex morphology is distributed in utterances, within utterances across languages. So for a cross-linguistic examination, one must find a way to operationalize LCI as a variable that captures difficulty, can be compared, and can be found in synchronic grammatical descriptions. So the first question is how to address difficulty, because difficulty depends not only on the language structure, but on the discursive and cognitive context that people engage when speaking. One cannot objectively assess that one linguistic unit is more difficult than another. Now, the concept of complexity may be used to establish such a connection between structural relationships and then speaker effects of linguistic difficulty. Because according to Palotti, linguistic difficulty can arise due to complex structure in the language. So complexity in language refers to the properties and relationships between linguistic elements, which may or may not cause difficulty in speakers. The task for this dissertation is to find the appropriate variables of complexity that reflects a stronger association to speaker difficulty. So the variables must mediate experimental evidence through language description. But how can this be done? So are there variables that have been proposed in which LCI is considered more complex than others? Well, according to Anderson, LCI can be classified as a type of complex allomorphy. And it classifies it under this parameter of complexity. So Anderson classifies morphology according to the conditioning context and concludes that this conditioning context determines complexity, and lexical conditioning may be perhaps the summit of complexity. So in effect, are the distinctions that are proposed phonologically, these are the ones that are proposed phonologically conditioned, does not increase complexity of allomorphy as much as grammatical conditioning, and lexical conditioning increases it the most. So, but what are allomorphs? Well, as a reminder for the ones that have taken linguistic courses, these are morphs that express the same features but have different forms. So like emos and emos, and then es and is in the Spanish conjugation. Same features, different forms. So here we can also see an allomorphic relationship where we have ven, vien, and ven, and vin, which express the same meaning and then different forms. But something tells me that allomorphy alone, well, does not fully capture the complexity of inflection or lexically conditioned inflection, because there are more inflectional types and conditioning does not apply to other morphs that aren't allomorphs. For example, hearers must also learn that the same form might express a different meaning depending on the verb or conjugation class. And this type of form-meaning relationship is called syncretism. And syncretic morphs are the ones that have the same form but different features. And syncretism is also inflection that is also lexically conditioned in this conjugation. Arguably, complexity can also increase because of conditioning of bigrammatical categories. So we can interpret and change from o to e in the suffix. A subject first person being conditioned by different grammatical or semantic contexts. But more plausible it is to say that these are cumulative morphs that exhibit two features. Well, first person and present, and then first person and past. Finally, we have the phenomenon of stem alternation. Stem alternation is also conditioned inflection because the shape and the stem alternates for different grammatical categories. However, not only certain parts of the stem are alternating, right? Not the entire stem morph. So this dissertation, I chose to analyze only inflectional morphs according to their conditioning because they occur in many verbs, have a similar degree of semantic generality, and have been both typologically and psycholinguistically researched. So to provide an exhaustive classification of all inflectional morphs, we must also account for the fact that there are Also morphs that aren't conditioned, that there's no allomorphy, no syncretism, or accumulation of other types. So I want to classify all inflection morphs. Phonological conditioning can only bring changes to the form of a morph, whereas grammatical condition inflection also includes morphs that can be classified as cumulative, more features. And then finally, we have lexically conditioned inflection, which can include all types above and stem alternations practically. So we can illustrate these different types of allomorphs by, for example, from Ura, an Austronesian language spoken in Vanuatu. The negative morpheme has several allomorphs like etwe when it precedes vowels and etwi when it precedes consonant, phonological conditioning. So now, grammatical conditioning, the subject prefix, on the other hand, is grammatical conditioned by tense. The subject morphemes for first and third person in distant past context are yam and ye, and for future context, yao and che or ke. Lastly, there's also stem alternation for tense. The verb sing is arufa here in distant past, but narufa in the future. When the verb is sit is used, then the root alternation is different. So arab versus ada. So these changes are lexically conditioned as they are dependent on the lexical morpheme, the root here. So with this exhaustive classification of inflection into conditioning type, we can research how these conditioned inflectional types correlate with speaker difficulty. And let's talk about phonological conditioning first. Are phonologically conditioned allomorphs more complex than unconditioned morph? According to some studies such as Martin and Pepperkamp 2020, there is no evidence for this. So in contrary, the phonological processes leading to allomorphy, such as assimilation or vowel harmony, were preferred in experiments than cases that did not involve these processes. This can also be witnessed in the acquisition by children. So what these experiments show is that the difficulty of a morph variants here is not dependent on it being phonologically conditioned, but based on the specific phonemes or phones involved. Let's look at some instances of grammatical conditioning. It has been shown in some experiments that speakers, such as children, often prefer morphs that are morphs that are far apart, yet which signal a close relationship between them, such as auxiliaries and suffixes in German. So this distributed morphological strategy can be classified as grammatical conditioning. And then cumulation, which also has been subsumed under the grammatical condition inflection category, also shows sometimes difficulties for children. The more meaning a morpheme carries, the more difficult it is apparently to learn because the meanings are not transparent. And finally, there is ample evidence for lexically conditioned being more difficult to learn. One interpretation is that with lexically conditioned inflection, two processing systems, one for processing lexical information and another for processing grammatical information, may be chosen depending on the relative frequency a lexeme occurs. So this non-uniformity leads to effects like overgeneralization of inflection classes and is quite a frequent phenomenon. So far, what these measures show is that grammatical and lexical conditioning pose challenges for speakers, whereas phonological conditioning does not suggest a uniform effect. But can we assume that lexical conditioning, as Anderson said, is more difficult than all of the other ones? Well, so far there hasn't been any research distinguishing this relationship in psycholinguistic studies. However, if we look at language-based complexity measures, which may correlate with speaker difficulty, lexical conditioning stands out as requiring a longer minimal description than systems that are merely phonologically or grammatically conditioned, because the list of lexemes that determine the classes is larger than the list of grammatical categories or phonological rules that would determine them. So of course, these measures are also dependent on inventory size and paradigm size, so it is hard to generalize. And the same holds for entropy measures, which depend on predictability. So intuitively, we can say that lexically conditioned inflection is not as predictable than phonologically or grammatically conditioned inflection. but this only applies to the context where speakers do not know the specific lexeme. This context may be, however, very frequently encountered in the discourse. It is usually lexemes that are novel for speakers and less so phonological grammatical environments. So consider the evidence from speaker-based complexity correlates. In comparison to language-based measurements, we may posit that lexical conditioning may be more difficult than grammatical conditioning, and phonological conditioning less difficult than grammatical conditioning, expanding Anderson's preliminary classification only on allomorphy. So that means this variable may be used for all inflectional morph types, not only allomorphs. With this said, we can now focus again on the question why speakers would tolerate more complex inflectional types, as Stahl has shown in this quote. So this question has to do with finding stable environments in which this complexity can thrive. So there could be multiple factors. For example, close-knit, socially and geographically isolated communities tend to tolerate more complexity in their language. Also connected to the fact that these languages are rarely learned as adults, as L2 learners, and therefore profit from a more faithful transition by L1 learners, children. Stability may be also explained by conformity to conventions, but these factors do not successfully capture the utterance internal stabilizing effects, the microscopic factors, which I can call here. So to know how complex morphology gets stabilized inside utterances, we need to know which structures are themselves stable, and the asymmetries and stabilities of certain structures would be reflected in distributional asymmetries of the structures in utterances. And this diachronic historical relationship allows us to focus on the synchronic distribution. So the given variables must have been already identified as stable to do a typology. So ideally, the stabilizing structure should have the size of inflectional morphs, because that's what I'm analyzing. So not smaller than phonemes. If like the phoneme stable, it doesn't stabilize the whole entire morph. This shows how there are different levels of analyzing utterances, so morphosyntactic and phonological and semantic structure, and both phonological and morphosyntactic structure can have units that are shorter and longer. And in principle, any structure may be tested according to their stabilizing potential, but we can assume that stable structures are the ones that facilitate communication. So we could start by choosing the ones that are facilitative through psycholinguistic experiments. Once we have narrowed down certain structures that facilitate communication, we can look at diachronic studies and see which of these structures are also stable. So there are several properties that can facilitate communication in language. Among these, prominence, entrenchment, transparency, economy, and other properties. And for this dissertation, I have selected two promising properties that may be associated with stability. So prominence and entrenchment. So prominence is the conscious and effectiveness of conveying information through prosodic, morphological, and semantic structure. And it's because it's a conscious within the structure, I argue it's a property of structure. More prominent units increase the salience in the mind of speakers, which facilitates learning. And in a survey that I concluded that prominent syllables, especially stressed ones, are stable linguistic units, while word boundaries are also prominent, but may not stabilize the morphology. So in tone-based languages, prominent tonal contrasts may be stable, but their role in stabilizing morphology is less clear. So this means, well, what I did was to prioritize choosing stress as a stabilizing variable in languages that had stress, and tonal contrast for languages that didn't have stress. And obviously they have, some of them have tonal languages, have tones. I did consider word edges, but only for morphs that weren't syllabic, meaning only consonantal. Okay, so the stabilizing effect of prominent syllables, here stress syllables, can be seen in this chart that shows the development from the phrase vuestra merced, your highness, to the your mercy, actually, to the second person formal pronoun usted, as we see in Spanish, and then we see also different lineages of this phrase, and it shows that it is only the stress syllables, wes and sed, that eventually survive, whereas the segment of the unstressed syllables are reduced and vanish over time. This shows how stress syllables are stable because of the prominence. And then the second facilitating property that I chose to investigate is entrenchment. Entrenchment refers to the degree to which a linguistic unit, such as a word or a grammatical structure, is firmly established in a speaker's mental lexicon, and it is dependent on frequency of occurrence. So the problem with entrenchment, however, is that it is hard to operationalize. Degrees of entrenchment of a certain structure are not usually found in grammatical descriptions, right? But since entrenchment is, according to Langacker, proportional to frequency of occurrence, we could resort to frequency counts of words and morphs. However, this method may still be difficult to do from grammars alone. So let's look at the stabilizing effects. So while any type of entrenchment and frequency facilitates the recall of structures and helps learning, not all sorts of frequencies have the same effects on stability of the unit. High token frequency of a linguistic unit can lead to reduction and loss of the elements involved in it. For example, with the phrase, oh, what happened here? Let me just, yeah, let's see. I think, okay, so let's come back to this. So high token frequency of a linguistic unit can lead to reduction and loss of elements involved in it. For example, with a phrase, God be with you, that reduced to goodbye, right? However, so reduced, right? Because it was frequently spoken. However, once morphemes have a high type frequency, which means they occur with many verbs or utterances, they are more likely to be stable, such as the ed suffix in English. With the high type frequency of the morphological pattern here, root plus past tense is entrenched in the mind of speakers, and then also it stabilizes the pattern. So high token frequency of the word, but low type frequency of morphs leads to the entrenchment of the word and not of the morphological template here. But then the question remains, how can we operationalize high type frequency of morphemes? So one of the solutions that I found is to choose obligatoriness. Of a morphological paradigm to account for high type frequency of morphs in paradigms. Okay, so we can probably look at obligatory paradigms and verbs. These occur in many utterances, and their morphs may therefore have a high type frequency, and that is indicative of stabilizing entrenchment. So to sum it up, I decided to establish a dependent variable with 3 values for inflectional complexity, which should correlate with speaking difficulty, like phonologically conditioned and unconditioned inflection as least complex, grammatically conditioned inflection as more complex, and lexically conditioned inflection as most complex. Then 2 independent variables with yes, possible, and no for mapping paradigms to prominent syllables and positions, and yes and no values for obligatory paradigms, with a distinction of whether obligatory paradigms have 0 morphs, meaning they're semantically obligatory, or no, meaning they're always formally obligatory. So in the following typologically investigation, I predict a higher complexity value, such as LCI, associated with a higher prominence value, such as yes and possible. And I also predict a higher complexity value associated with yes value for obligatoriness. So let's look at the languages involved. So the main language sample has 30 languages with lexically conditioned verbal inflection. And I try to use one language per linguistic family or stock so that there is genetic and geographic diversity. And then we have two control samples, 6 languages which do not have LCI, but have grammatically conditioned inflection, and 5 languages that have neither lexically nor grammatical conditioned inflection, but they have phonologically or unconditioned inflection. So these are all the languages from across the world. So to map the different values, I chose to align the verbal morphology of these languages into positions. So here, for this Austronesian language, Ura, that I showed you earlier, we have 6 prefix positions. So like from 0 to -6, and 3 suffix positions. So whenever a position included inflectional morphs, I annotated it as inflectional. For any given inflectional position, I would prioritize annotating the most complex type of conditioning. If there was LCI, I would annotate the entire position as LCI, but only focus on these morphs that are LCI. And if the position had UCI and GCI morphs, I would only consider GCI morphs. So the UCI positions are the ones that only have unconditioned or phonologically conditioned inflection. So as we can see here in Ura, we have many positions that have inflectional morphs, like 3 with LCI morphs, 2 with GCI morphs, and 2 with only UCI morphs. This language has stress on the last syllable of the words, or I think it was the second to last syllable of the word, which means that, it has on the last syllable of the word, which means that the last suffix position is always stressed when present. But the stem and suffix position 1 can also be stressed as an additional rule. Interestingly, position -6 can also be stressed in some examples, but the prefix position in between position 6 and the stem never receives stress. So based on only this language, we can see that the more complex positions are more likely stressed, and the least complex positions are never stressed, with GCI position representing an in-between behavior. For example, one of the GCI position says possible, and then the other one says no. And this pattern, where more complex inflectional positions receive the highest prominence values, is also exists in tonal languages, where tonal contrast, I established them as a sign of prominence, such as in Zacatepec Chatino. So the stem which hosts LCI, which is lexically conditioned inflection, can have all 5 tones, and as you can see here, the very high, the high, and so on, and including the most prominent tones. So the GCI position can only have 2 to 4 tones, which is here the prefix, and then the UCI position, which is this suffix, only has morphs with 1 type of tone, the so-called neutral tone. Okay, let's look at obligatoriness, how it patterns. And this language, Aguaruna from the Amazon, shows in a nutshell that obligatoriness can be associated with a higher complexity value. For example, the only LCI position and GCI, one of the GCI position, are obligatory, but not the UCI position. Okay, so now let's look at the big picture across languages. From the sample of languages that have LCI, we can see that this pattern is reflected across languages. So the 327 positions of the LCI sample that I annotated show that LCI, and to a certain lesser degree GCI, is associated with prominence. This association is highly significant and persists even when removing the stem position. Why would one remove those positions? Well, because almost all tokens for inflectional stem alternation are LCI, and no other types of inflections and stems also tend to, and no other types of inflection. And then also stems tend to attract stress across language. But even then, this pattern persists when taking out the stems. So let's compare it with a GCI sample, the control sample. So here we have 1 category less GCI and UCI and non-inflectional positions. And yes, I did also look at the pattern of non-inflectional morphs. However, I did not classify these positions according to complexity types. This might explain why the association are leveled out in this position that may include more and less complex non-inflectional types. But what stands out here is that even for the GCI sample, there is a significant association between more complex inflection, which is GCI, and prominence. When we look at how the patterning of inflection and prominence behaves in UCI languages, we see that there is no significant difference to the non-inflectional positions. So we don't have GCI or we don't have LCI. This may be due to prominence being indeed not associated with inflectional position, or it could mean that I need more data to show it. Generally, this does not go against the hypothesis according to which more complex positions are more prominent. Now let's look at obligatoriness. So the pattern is kind of similar for LCI languages. However, there weren't as many positions that were obligatory. And in some languages, only the stem position was obligatory. So because stems are always there. Furthermore, distinguishing whether paradigms were semantically or formally obligatory did not improve the correlation as much. While we see a significant association between more complex position and obligatoriness, the pattern is non-significant when excluding stems, because so many stems are per se obligatory. Okay. So, and quite interesting, obligatory was only significantly associated with grammatically conditioned inflection in the GCI sample when excluding stems, but not when including it. Because the non-inflectional categories had a lot of stems, that the contrast of obligatoriness within inflectional categories was not a start, I think. So including the NI rendered the contrast less stark, and excluding it was like significant. So for UCI position, significance was not determined since there were many empty cells and only one inflectional position of all the 5 languages was obligatory. Okay, wrapping up, we can generally conclude that both prominence, obligatory, and obligatoriness determine the distribution of complex inflection that are associated with it, LCI and GCI, and this may be a sign for stabilizing effects going on. And I interpret this as the case where prominent and frequent environments help overcome difficulties, and that these environments, as assessed through the studies, can have a stabilizing potential as well. So let's think about the wider theoretical implication for a functionalist and usage-based perspective to linguistics. So the core idea that distilled is that structure itself can be identified as a factor that's stabilizing other structures. The question is how this fits into a model where language structure is seen as mostly the product of emergence. So what I mean is that, for example, language structure evolves from speakers interacting with the environments, and then the environment can be cognitive, physical, social, geographical. So this view can be accommodated with an evolutionary perspective, according to which structures survive because the environment the speaker interact with favor the replication of this structure. So, and according to evolutionary literature, we have evolutionary change is a 2-step process. So we have generation of variation where multiple variants evolve due to altered replication and innovation. And then we have selection of these variants leading to differential replication. According to Croft, this also happens with utterances when they get selected by speakers because the speakers interact with the environment. Differential replication of variants occurs if one variant is chosen over another due to certain reasons. These reasons can be, of course, prominence, as we can see here. So we would expect few variants to emerge that have the form, for example, SRA, right? That's evolving from Western Mercedan variants that inherited material from stressed environments. So basically, there is altered replication, which occurs in a automatic accidental fashion. And then we can think of mutation. We can compare it to mutations that occur randomly and constantly, but differential replication yields similar results in different lineages. and this is due to selection processes. So let's draw this evolutionary relationship. So we have the speakers, and then they interact with their environment. And as a result, they select utterances, and utterances involve language structure that is replicated. And every speaker replicates it differently, so there is always altered replication. However, certain interactions with the environment lead to differential replication, the survival and propagation of one variant over the other. Now, how do the findings of the dissertation change or expand this picture? Well, this model sure explains why some structural units change and have a different distribution. And these factors shaping the distribution can be summarized as different constraints in the environment that facilitate communication. And prominence and entrenchment are part of these constraints. However, what we are seeking is stability. And we've seen that prominence or frequency alone do not determine whether a structure is stable, right? Token versus type frequency, for example. So we can visualize it in the following. We have different levels, for example, the phonological and then the morphological level, and then we can translate the different inflectional types into more or less favorable environments. So since LCI is more difficult, it would be less preferred in utterances. However, the overlapping structure, because it's the same structure, just from a different level, prominent syllables are preferred in utterances. So LCI can be stable because the syllable that is prominent is stable, and not because LCI has a preferred feature in language that makes it stable. And that's why we need to specify the structure link as opposed to the mere functional aspect. Okay, so in the end, how can we accommodate the structural link within the relationship between speaker, structure, and environment? So we basically have the same picture, but now we can say that replicated structure can impact the differential replication of future replicated structure. And one way to understand it is that replicated structure forms part of the environment with which speakers interact. So speakers select utterances and replicate structure, but this structure ends up being one part of the environment that influences the choices of speakers. So we can say that structure itself influences the differential replication of other structures, but via the speaker. Okay, so back to the Gabelins quote. What is it that makes languages cling to these difficult forms? Well, the network of overlapping structures and their impact on the stability of other structures may be one factor. Obviously, this relationship is in further need of investigation, like diachronic studies and so on, but I hope that my dissertation has proved one step to think further into this direction. And so as a conclusion, I'd like to summarize the contribution to the field of linguistics. We have first typology, where the challenge was to operationalize typological variables based on diachronic and psycholinguistic evidence. Usually it's the reverse of structural variables and construction, and then one sees how they can be explained cognitively, right? So this extends the possibility of typological research. So then, of course, the distinction between complexity variables that can be used to study effects on speakers. And then for functional linguistics, I'd like to say that functional and non-functional phenomenon should be studied together, not necessarily in a one-to-one compensatory fashion, but with regards to how structure itself impacts this compensation. So I'd like to also emphasize that structure is not only emergent from functional principle, but can form and be maintained because of the interaction between speakers and other structural elements, forming an additional feedback loop in the complex system of language. Finally, also, this dissertation has provided data on further research on 41 verbal templates of 41 languages, annotated for categories and values that have been defined in a way that might help future researchers. And thank you so much for bearing with me. Thanks. Okay.
So maybe Professor Von Prince, can you go first?
Okay, so Professor Von Prince, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes. Oh, somehow the volume it says 0, but I barely can hear. Maybe.
Can you see that?
Yeah, let me just
Stop share.
yeah, stop share. I'm gonna do stop share and then do here. Oh gosh. Okay. So okay, and then it says 0. That never happened. But can you say something again?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, very. Oh god.
I can use the chat otherwise.
It's partly mine because it says on my computer I cannot increase the volume for some reason. Is it here?
No, it's not. How come you can't increase the volume?
Let me just do it like this and then. Oh, now I can increase the volume. Well, it was just a projector thing. Okay. And no, maybe just. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. And now it was just because
Okay.
it was on, and then I couldn't. Okay.
Okay, let's try this. Yeah, thanks for the presentation and thanks for inviting me to be part of this committee. It's an interesting dissertation and it was an interesting talk summarizing your findings. But you know that I was going to show you a couple of hardball questions. So, yeah. So I'm going to support maybe my question by typing also in the chat so you can catch the most important keywords here. I was wondering, this is not the topic of your dissertation, but there's a big picture question here concerning frameworks of morphological theory. And as far as I can see, there are basically two, in very broad strokes, two main competitors to how morphology works. And those are word and paradigm types of approaches as opposed to generative types of approaches, right? Do you have any thoughts on how your approach and findings relate to the distinction between these two types of frameworks?
Yeah, so I did not think about that. I wanted to approach it from a usage-based perspective, and there has not be such a theoretical consistency in usage-based morphology. I mean, Bybee and also I couldn't really distinguish between these two. I could not have the theoretical background to answer this question right now.
So the word and paradigm type of approach would be more usage-based, but that's why I was wondering, because while reading your dissertation, I often had the feeling that you were presupposing a more type of generative framework where you think more in terms of features plus rules, and not so much in terms of basically paradigms where you fill in the different cells based on similarities or analogies to other cells. And that's why I was wondering, because you say you're usage based, but what I read was a little more generative, or what's shown between the lines. So
yeah, so I think that when describing like description length and especially there, I recurred to rules, but then description length was only one measure, and it was very eclectic to derive or to address complexity from all these conditioning to that. But yeah, I would say conditioning. Yeah, if I think about conditioning, it's not like an element that really conditions something. It's just a strategic shortcut to identify across parameters one category that may correlate with complexity. So I think that in chapter 6, I addressed how can conditioning of allomorphy be understood from an evolutionary perspective, and then I brought up network theories. I think, very eclectic, but in the end, I do argue for usage-based. And like templates, I would say paradigms can be understood as abstract schemas across words that emerge from the interaction of like single words or groups of words. And I think probably the generative, more formalist part of this dissertation is just a way to operationalize variables. While the core of my dissertation aims for a usage-based functionalist perspective.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, do you have any other questions?
Oh, am I supposed to keep going? Yeah, I can keep going.
I don't know, Carolyn, how much okay.
Yeah. We can go do rounds though too, right?
Sure. Well, ask something else now, and then
okay. So, well, big picture or very small detail? Maybe very small detail for a change, and then the next person can ask their question. You had the slide on the paradigm from Eura, where you classified each position.
Yeah.
Maybe show that again.
Yeah, I can.
Everyone.
So I think, yeah, I think I said something incorrect about the stress, but then it would have explained something. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So position -3, iterative.
Okay.
You classified that as derivation. Why?
Yeah, because with the I looked like a flow chart, inflectional versus non-inflectional categories. I did exclude iterative as not the first main two aspects. I only looked at perfective versus imperfective, and the other aspects I left out because they could be too close to the meaning of the stem and less inflectional. But then if one, for example, iterative would co-occur with those main distinction, like perfective and imperfective, then I would include that. And I don't remember here exactly with iterative if it does co-occur distributively with another paradigm. But yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, yeah, I'll give off to the next person, but I can ask more questions if you want me to. So
let's go to the next question. Melissa, do you want to go here because the mic is yeah. I don't know. Okay, I'm sorry. Because I
wanted step very carefully.
Yes, no problem. It's my rule. I just wanted to ask you if you would clarify a little bit about what you meant about accumulation, and also how you decided whether it was yes, no, or possible. What does possible mean?
Okay. So the question was about accumulation. I think I said something in chapter 2 that if you cannot, if there's basically evidence that two paradigms are interacting, like formal evidence, like for example, stem alternation, there's always one segment that stays the same, and then the other one that doesn't stay the same. So that would be cumulation for me. And then if it's not cumulation, then it's, for example, you have one morph that is expressed in a certain past tense environment. Let's see, is there an example in English? Like, for example, the ed suffix can be also used not in past, but also in like irrealities, like I wanted to do something. So that would be not cumulation. Okay, but if there's like sing, sang, sung, sung, it has the s and ng from singing, and then and the middle vowel has both, so that would be cumulation. And then for in Spanish, the endings like oh, that I would say that's cumulation, and then as versus s, that would be cumulation because there's one segment that is different. conjugation class to conjugation class. Okay, and then for the other one is oops, I think I have to exit. Okay, here possible. So actually, let me get back to ura or yura. It's actually the second to last syllable that is stressed, like it says narufa, and then the last position is always stressed because it's like more like a clitic. And so possible means sometimes it aligns. Sometimes the stem morphemes align, like for example here narufa, it's stressed with a acute accent, and sometimes it does not align. Sometimes in other word forms, the first prefix may be aligned, and so or the object prefix. So for example, in word forms that have this suffix, like object transitive, then the object transitive suffix is stressed, and then it doesn't fall on the stem. And that's why both can have possible here. Whereas here, this last is always stressed because it's kind of its own word.
So possible is kind of sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Whenever something appears, it's always stressed, whereas wherever something appears, it's sometimes stressed. Okay.
I also wanted to say that I really enjoyed reading this.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Want to go here and not step on the table?
No problem.
But I think at this point we can step on it.
No,
I
I don't
a
want-
good idea.
You don't want to trip.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lucas, for your wonderful presentation. I also enjoyed it, like Melissa said. So my question is about what are some examples of prominent morphemes that tend to be accessed first, based on your study, according to your data, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, I guess what types of morphemes?
Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering are accessed first, and then what are some other examples of prominence? Are other things tied to stress? It can't just only be stress that makes a morpheme prominent, right, in the language. So I was wondering what else that kind of ties that unit together to make it prominent.
Thank you, that was a really interesting question, and I did talk about this in my dissertation. I think this is the part where I mostly left out, talk about other types of prominence. There is also semantic prominence, like pragmatic, what is like recent or so versus what's not recent. There's also morphological prominence, and morphological prominence is basically like a transparent form meaning mapping. And across languages, obviously, stems are more prominent than suffixes or prefixes. And yeah, I definitely could use a lot of your example from your dissertation where you talk about the stem in Navajo being the most prominent morphological unit, but also has stress or like more contrast, like McDonough said. So I would say with the morphological prominence, there's affixes and there's stems, and the stems are more prominent. Yeah. Is there anything else I missed? Yeah. Yeah.
I would say, so is there, after the stem, is there another one? Is there like a pattern that kind of emerged based on your data, the next type of
Oh.
that would be accessed?
Okay, so I did not look at morphological prominence, but I would say what is prominent? Maybe derivational affixes would be more prominent if they have a high type frequency. If not, they would be like merged cognitively with the stem as one meaning. And then inflectional affixes, I would say they're like pretty automatic. They're like not really semantically prominent. They're like obligatory. And it's interesting that it's like stress would then fall on the more complex inflectional ones. Is there anything else? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, now let's go to Bill.
From this way.
It's a little. Okay, well, thanks very much, Lucas. It was a great presentation. And I just want to say to the audience that, we dissertation committee members always want to ask hard questions, but I do want to emphasize that this is a very impressive dissertation. So now for my first set of hard questions. I'll save the second set if we have time for a second round, but this is about the quantitative part, chapter 5 in the statistics. So first thing I want to say is I don't see why you need to have the NI category in there, because as you say, you're sort of lumping together everything that's not inflectional. That's what NI is. So you didn't really make any hypotheses about what you expected it to show. And then even when you got a result, it's like, what does it mean? Because you've got stems in there, derivational things and phrases. So I would suggest running this without the NI column. I don't think it's going to change anything. Then the other thing is that I kind of questioned about was you took these 3 subsamples and ran the statistics separately. Now, in the beginning, you did mention I think in chapter 2 that there might be some psycholinguistic evidence suggesting that maybe they behaved a little differently. But you didn't really test that. And, I'm the one who asked you to put in those languages that didn't have the LCI, just like I asked Shalise to put in the languages that weren't, that didn't have consonantal complexity. But I expected you to lump them all together. And that would be good in a couple of respects. Well, first I can say, just by looking at the split results, they're all in the same trend, even if some of them weren't statistically significant. So I think you could lump them all together. In fact, if you want to test the hypothesis of, well, if you don't have lexical condition inflection, then it makes a difference. You'd be testing that by comparing the two. But I think it's better. Then you'll have more instances of GCI and UCI that you might be able to run, do something more significant on that. And then my last point with respect to the quantitative method is just a little flame here. You have a section which is called something like explaining the outliers for the LCI. And you bring in other factors which might account for the cases where LCI was in non-prominent positions or non-prominent positions didn't contain LCI morphemes. But if you're going to do, and linguists love to do this, it's the traditional methodology or explanatory approach, but really from a quantitative perspective, if you think there's other factors in there, you should be throwing them all together and running it. Oh, and that reminds me, another point is in the last part of your statistical analysis, and I think you even showed it in your presentation, you were comparing prominence and frequency or obligatoriness to show that they were actually rather correlated. But you just showed that. I mean, I think the statisticians in the audience do know better than me, but it seemed to me like what you should do is you should be running some kind of regression analysis to figure out which one is actually contributing or how much each is contributing to the observed result. So looking at the two explanatory factors together and figuring out, and if they're highly correlated, it's possible that one of them, you put the two together, one of them may not have much of an explanatory contribution. And I don't know if you could, it's easy for you to run a few more statistics just lumping together stuff in the way I suggested, but I don't know how easy it would be to do that, but it would be nice. And I'll save my theoretical questions for the next one. It was just the power cord.
Yeah, just a small comment. Yeah, thank you, Bill. Those are really wonderful suggestions. I thought after all, yeah, the NI non-inflectional category just even leads to less significance when looking at the whole picture. Like as I said in the in the control sample, that it was significant without the NI, and then with the NI it just it just messed things up. And also, yeah, like 6 or 5 languages are not that much to test the control sample like separately. So yeah, I should probably lump them together and then maybe split them and say, yeah, even in the LCI sample we have the same distribution as in the overall sample. I think there's got to be the same, like a similar
Looks like
distribution.
it. Just looking at the raw numbers that you have in the table.
Okay, well, yeah,
For the LCI, yeah.
for the LCI,
LCI was kind of all over the place. And
yeah.
What's in there is all over the place.
Yeah.
I was not surprised.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. I don't know if I should comment anything else. Do you comment? Okay. Yeah. Well, Caroline.
Okay. Hi, well, as other people have said, this is extremely ambitious, and I think you managed to, I'm going to mix my metaphors, but I thought you were biting off a lot, but you managed to chew most of it, something like that. So I had a few things I thought about, picking up on what Melvitha mentioned. Prominence, obviously something I'm interested in. And I was, for tonal languages, you seem to basically take high pitch as the most prominent. And I feel like that's maybe not really the most, how shall we say, doesn't capture what is likely to be going on. I was going to search for something and I forgot beforehand, but I think there's been studies showing that change in F0, so movement, tonal movement, so falling and rising are more psycholinguistically salient than a high level would be. And obviously not all tonal languages have contratones. So when you have a really simple tonal system, like for example, Navajo, it's basically tone or not, high tone or not tone. So in that case, just the high would be arguably more prominent. But in Southeast Asian languages where you have all kinds of stuff going on, I think the high level tone, no way, would be perceptually the most prominent. And I can't give you a citation off the top of my head, but I'm sure with a little bit of looking we could find something. So that was kind of one comment, is at least maybe acknowledge that tonal systems could have more complex things going on. I'm not asking you to do, in terms of psycholinguistics of tone, but just sort of acknowledge that the situation may be more complex. And again, following up on what Melvitha has said, I would argue that you certainly considered word boundaries in the dissertation. You didn't say much today, obviously, but in the text you talk a fair amount about this. And there's tons of evidence that word onsets are incredibly important for lexical retrieval, for example. And so I think that is another thing. I mean, both edges of the word can be prominent, but in terms of accessing words, there's just all kinds of evidence that, if you get the first few sounds right, that's how you're going to access it. And when I mistype things in Google, if you make a mistake on the first letter, you're totally sunk. It's not going to come anywhere close. But if you make even more drastic mistakes further on into the word, it can figure out what you meant. Okay, so beginning of the word is super important in terms of access and retrieval. And so I sort of felt like you got more on the end of the word boundary than on the beginning of the word boundary, and the psycholinguistic evidence more points to the reverse. So you can acknowledge this. Well, that was one of my main points. Just a more general thought is that in terms of your sort of selection process that you talk about in chapter 6, so much of the variation you kind of gave the impression that we were talking about allomorphs that were really distinct. You know, it's like this and that, and there's no gray zone. They're very categorically different. Whereas in reality, so much variation is incredibly gradual. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Thank you for those comments and questions. Can I comment to the other comments first? Like the okay, so for the prominence, I did only consider the highest tone when the author said that it was prominent, and then I started to look at which tone does not occur. It's the marked one, and usually it was the high tone, although in Navajo it's like the high tone is the marked one, but whatever. And then for yeah, and then I looked at tonal variability. But yeah, I definitely will I say concretize my methodology there, because yeah, it was a bit hard to work with tonal languages. It's like I almost didn't want to mention them today, but okay. And then the other one was, can you again just give me a clue about the second question?
The fact that allomorphs aren't always categorically.
The second tones, and then you said something about
word
onset, exactly. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I did not consider word onset or word coda as alone single determinants for variable, but always with stressed syllables or prominent syllables. So if a consonantal morph was at the end of word and it belonged to a stressed syllable, then it would receive a yes value, otherwise not. So I was more strict with consonantal morphs, and then the same at the beginning. But this is a good comment about the beginning being way more prominent than the end. Yeah. Okay, then for the selection and replication process, I bet you, Bill, also have some comments, but I did see like maybe the variation of the allomorphs. I would sometimes, if they're like form variants, like if phonologically conditioned, or there's like they're similar, I would definitely see the variation as altered replication process that happens a lot, and every speaker pronounces it differently, and there's always some change. But then, which allomorphs get then basically conventionalized in the language? That's I would argue is selection, but Bill, maybe you would argue otherwise. But so what gets manifested in the system, what gets more entrenched afterward and more common, that it's what the allomorphs that are selected over time as just the variation that is altered replication. So differential replication versus altered replication. Okay.
Well, do we want to give another?
Yeah. Kilu, would you like to say something more?
Absolutely. So you said in your dissertation that syncretism, and also in the talk, syncretism increases description length. So I'm gonna type a small toy example in the chat, where, okay, you have two languages, each has 3 pronouns. In language 1, the first pronoun is ma for the first person, second person is ta, third person is sa. Okay. Language 2, the first person is ma, the second person is ta, the third person is ma. Same description length?
Same description length. That's, oh my God. I think it is probably the same description length, but if of the paradigm, right? it depends, obviously. If you just list the formal variants, ma appears one time, and then you specify ma occurs in one, and then ma occurs in first person, and ma occurs in third person. That I would say it's probably the same description length. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That was a slightly strong overgeneralization that you made.
Yeah, I think in the new version, did I say still that syncretism increases the description length? Because
I'd have to check, to be honest.
okay,
I'd have to check.
because first I argued with allomorphy, and then I tried to say, oh, syncretism is a side effect of allomorphy, but it's not. Yeah, so maybe I'll have to look over it and exclude syncretism from description.
Yeah, it looks like.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Well, okay, last one. I think you showed a slide saying Nichols says linguistic complexity increases in isolation. But I don't think that's what Nichols says.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Linguistic diversity in space and time. You have the hotspots in the Caucasus and in Papua New Guinea and in the Amazon and in the Western United States. And these are not languages that are highly isolated. These are actually languages that are in a lot of contact with extremely different languages.
Okay. Yeah, I actually read that book like I don't know, 7 years ago or so. Yeah, I think it cannot be like close-knit communities the same as isolation, right?
Well, I think
yeah.
It's correct or not.
I think I clustered a lot of references on the top, and then I looked at where was it, like the stabilizing effects, and then
Yeah.
I took like all the and then
that's it.
Yeah, okay, that's wrong. It's not social isolation. It's how would you rephrase it? It's like geographically bound, or because the Caucasus languages were there forever, they did not spread out, and then California.
Exactly. Yeah, isolation is maybe not the right word, but maybe there's a certain stability that comes with the terrain in a sense. So I mean, Nichols talks about residual zones, right? That's supposed to capture the fact that large colonizer movements do not touch those areas in the same way that they range across other terrains, basically. I'm not sure what the best term is for that.
Yeah, Melissa suggests bound geographically.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's probably a better term. Okay.
Thank you for that comment. That is important.
Yeah.
Okay. Any
other questions? Yeah, we maybe should ask if anybody either not on the committee but physically present would like to say anything. Or anybody in Zoom?
So in Zoom we do have some comments. For example, Rashid Sagruni, high token and type frequency entrenchment prominence are indicative of a productive grammatical structure, even though they are not sufficient to explain productivity. How come then you haven't explored the relationship between productivity and stable grammatical complexity? That's a good question. I would say productivity and high type frequency, are very correlated. And I could also mention productivity, but I did not. And so yeah, I did not look at productivity. And productivity. I may have mentioned that in the dissertation. I don't remember how I elaborated on it, so I'm sorry. But yeah, they're connected, definitely. Productivity and high type frequency. Okay, then we have other. We have, that's the only one. Anyone from Zoom would like to ask a question? Okay, someone in the audience.
Yeah, so
Laura,
just very quick. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, really nice presentation. I'd love to read the whole dissertation. So I naturally would support Carolyn Smith's question about correlating high tone with prominence, because there's a lot of discussion against that proposal, especially in the tone literature. But that's not my real question. So my question as a Bantuist is, how did you choose Kinyamwezi as the one Bantu language you included out of 500? Was this convenient sample, or did you have another reason?
Okay, that's a good question.
And I would say a related question is, I've forgotten, it's been a long time since I've looked. I'm sure you looked at Schoenberg and Muganga's book, because that's the most longest description. And I can't remember how detailed their discussion is of all the tense aspect morphology, and especially the tone patterns associated with the tense aspect morphology, because for Bantuists, I would say it's the number and the complexity of the tone patterns that go with the tense aspect morphology that are, say, a salient, that are particularly salient. And I was wondering how that then would fit in to your study of complexity, if you hadn't looked, well, yeah, how would that fit in?
Okay, so for Kinyamwezi, I actually looked at a couple of languages. First, in Africa, there's a lack of LCI, and Kinyamwezi is part of the GCI sample that only has grammatically conditioned inflection, but not LCI. And I could choose any other language, but then Kinyamwezi had like a template in the grammar, which literally helped me outline the template outside, and also more, I don't know, more glosses. And also like it had like a high tone that was also prominent. I think some
so why do you think the high tone is prominent, besides the fact that I guess most Bantuists would say high tone is unmarked, but
no
other way prominent in the
so in Kinyamwezi, I think it was unmarked, the high tone. So
yeah, most Bantuists would say high tone is unmarked, but that's not really the same as saying it's prominent.
Or
in the same way that stress is. I mean, in some abstract philosophical sense, perhaps it's prominent. But
yeah, I have to look at it again, how I classified it. But yeah, probably only because there was like a nice template there.
Okay, and then just one other quick follow-up question. I mean, these are meant as, it was a really nice presentation, and these are meant as issues for further reflection, perhaps. But I really liked your quote at the beginning about about Sprachgefühl, and how some things stick around in a language because somehow it's they're native speakers of the language consider them defining properties of the language, even though they're complex. And speaking as a non-native speaker, trying to remember all the different genders in German and French and other languages I've learned, I sure wish native speakers had decided they were too complex to hang on to. But turning to Bantu languages, I mean, Bantu languages are known for having quite complex tense aspect morphology and tonal patterns that go along with that morphology, which again, as a non-native speaker, seem extremely complex. But so the relationship to your Sprachgefühl idea is that there's also a small literature in Bantu languages saying that somehow for Bantu native speakers of Bantu languages, this tense aspect morphology is a defining property of the languages. So you see new tense aspect morphology being created as well. And the tone patterns seem to be extremely stable. And again, have you thought more about this idea of what sort of the the spirit of the language, I guess you'd say, is a factor in maintaining complex patterns.
Yeah, I mean, the spirit of the language, I think it's entrenchment. No,
Oh,
not
entrenchment. That's not as poetic, nearly as poetic as spirit of the language, but okay.
Yeah. not only, but like the different environments we find itself, and like also prominence, as I said, and yeah, people also react differently to errors, like across language, and that's like a social convention issue. I think it's very different across language how much sanctioning you do and how much variability you allow. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, such a nice presentation.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you all. I think what we need to do now is have the committee meet. So I'm gonna have to ask the rest of people on Zoom maybe to leave, or shall we go into a I'll try and let me try and create a breakout room. It's a while since I did this, so breakout rooms,
And then
and I want to assign manually.
one.